Hey everyone, welcome to this conversation that I had with Professor Iris Berent. It was a riveting, engaging, and fascinating conversation. We discussed some of her work in our blindness to human nature, how that blindness is innate to human nature itself. We spoke about the twin principles of essentialism and dualism. Some amazing work she's done on how the kind of the beliefs that us lay people have. And I even managed to, in fact, ask her a lot more speculative questions, which I really haven't heard her, publicly at least discuss before, on Qualia and consciousness, and even psychoanalysis and our old mate Freud, and she gave her views on those two. Of course, given I'm a neophyte, there were certain parts where I wasn't too familiar with the specifics of her research, so forgive me if I didn't do a good job at engaging a bit more with more of her specific points. Nonetheless, you could find most of her papers online on open journals. Firstly, a bit of a formal introduction, let's say. Professor Iris Berent is a cognitive psychologist at Northeastern University. She's the author of The Phonological Mind and The Blind Storyteller, which we discuss rather extensively on the podcast. Her research seeks to unveil human nature and our intuitive understanding of it to shed light on human nature. She explores the human capacity for language using phonology as a case study. Saying all that, without further ado, here's my conversation with Professor Iris Berent. Firstly, if you don't mind, a bit of a personal question. If I'm not mistaken, I believe you initially studied musicology,
True.
and then you sort of transitioned into studying psychology, and currently your research is more in specifically cognitive psychology. So
Right.
perhaps you could just kind of give us a few ideas on as to what you find interesting in this field and what made you want to do research in cognitive psychology.
So my background is very varied, but to me, it's all a single story that's completely coherent because I think, it's interesting how you look at your life history and you discover that in retrospect, it was all the same thing.
Oh,
Uh, it was all really interest in human nature. It's really this question of why we know the way we do, are the things that we are bound to think about, to entertain, are there certain truths we are bound to hold just by virtue of the fact that we have, a human genome, basically. And that always really, really kind of bugged me. I think it came primarily from reading Chomsky very early on when I was really young, and it kind of stayed with me for many years. And at first, this was a question that I explored with respect to music. So there, the question was, are there some structural properties that are common to all musics, if you will, that we are born with and make us perceive music in a certain way. And that was super difficult at the time. So we gradually, transitioned into easier question about language, and finally kind of remain more in the domain of human nature and itself, in the sense of, can we understand our own human nature? And that's where I am right now.
excellent. Yeah. I mean, before I jump into your book, of course, I kind of want to ask a few more general questions.
Mhm.
So you said that it was, well, initially human nature or understanding human nature, but also reading Chomsky, which is clear from reading your work. I don't want to
Mhm.
call you a Chomskyan. That's like a crass way of putting it, but it seems like you're settling more on, let's say, uh, Chomsky's side over someone like B.F. Skinner.
Mhm.
So I would, if you don't mind, I would love for you to sort of elucidate this ongoing, I don't want to call it a war, but debate between the Skinner's side and Chomsky's side. And in fact, in one podcast, you even said that this debate is still ongoing. It's not like it's
Yeah.
done.
Yeah, very much so. Nothing changes.
Yeah, like there's
Even
not a conclusive, this is the answer sort of thing, which is what's lovely about science, in my view. So what's this debate in linguistics and cognitive science between Chomsky and Skinner?
so the debate at the time was how to explain behavior, and generally in linguistic behavior in particular, And Skinner was hoping to explain that in terms of properties of the information that's available to us, so what's out there in the environment, and this and responses and the links between them and associations that we form between them. And basically the idea is that to explain how we behave, which is all he cared about, all we need to do is look at the properties of what's out there rather than what the organism brings internally to that, how the organism views the stimulus and how the organism chooses to respond. And what Chomsky made very clear is that the study of behavior ought to start with the study of the organism. It's really kind of, maybe you can think about it as a form of biology, thinking about what is it that the organism brings with themselves to this task. So to make it very concrete, so why is it that you understand a sentence? How is it that you have a sentence such as John is eager to please? How do you know that it's John who is being pleased? Whereas if John is easy to please, then put it the other way around. So if John is easy to please, it is the one who is being pleased is John, whereas if John is eager to please, then he is pleasing Bill or somebody else, right? And what Chomsky made clear is that interpretations such like that, the only way to make sense of them is to figure out what is it that the person knows about language and how they encode the information that's available to them. And he pointed out that our ability to do so, to encode the information that's available to us, is constrained in part by innate principles of language that he called universal grammar.
And would you say that's sort of something like innate knowledge that you write about in this book?
Yeah. So as I read Chomsky, this is primarily a treatise on human nature and about innate knowledge, which he happened to advance in the domain of language, but I always read him as a philosopher, essentially.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, he in fact, I believe he was he chaired the Department of Philosophy at MIT probably for a long time, so he has a really good background in philosophy, certainly. Also, Professor, so with the idea of universal grammar, I've always been thinking about that idea, like is universal grammar itself this type of innate knowledge, and is it something that we can sort of study analytically?
Literally, and empirically.
Beautiful.
And I would say experimentally, So all you need is to start with a good theory of what you think universal grammar is all about. And then go to the lab and try to figure out, do you have evidence for this thing? And it's not easy, but it's doable.
I see. So if we could play a bit of devil's advocate, because I've read, in fact, apart from Chomsky's political work, of course, I've read his book on language, which was an excellent read, and I found it quite hard to read as a neophyte, to be totally honest. But I do know there are certain people still in the field, as you said, it's an ongoing debate, that kind of are either critical or disagree with some of Chomsky's ideas, or let's say the ideas of universal grammar. So what are the current criticisms of this idea of innate knowledge or universal grammar?
So to make it clear, I think that in fact the majority of the field no longer sides with Chomsky. I'm not totally convinced in my reading of the evidence that that's right and that's the right conclusion. The debates, as I see it in the domain of language, have always structured or have always centered on two issues. One is, what is the machinery that you need to represent language? So what kind of representations that you have, and are they structured? Are they structured in a systematic way? Do you need something that is akin to algebraic rules, or all you have is basically associations, very rich set of associations, which apparently this is what GPT is doing, AI is doing these days. So A is what kind of representations do you have? And do you need explicit structure in your data, so to speak? The second question is where these representations and the rules, the way you operate over these representations, where is all this machinery coming from? And is it in part specific to language? So are you born with some principles that are unique to language, and that's what allows you to acquire language? Or are you relying entirely on generic mechanisms that operate across domains? So what is your machinery, and how specific it is, where it's coming from? These have always been the questions. And the debate these days are center on whether there are in fact algebraic rules. So this is huge debate about that, which has been increased and confounded by the rise of AI, because proponents of that state, like, look, you have these systems that seem to do just fine, and it's not clear, but some people, there is a question of whether they in fact have any algebraic representations at all. And the range of possibilities range between those who say there aren't any structured representations in there at all, or that maybe they start without them and they grow them somehow. And all this becomes really difficult to tell, just because there is so much data that these systems are exposed to, that it's really hard. So one of the tests that, how do you know that there is an algebraic rules? One of the way to test it is to look at generalizations. Can you generalize to items that are not similar to anything that you've seen before? But if your data set includes everything that we have, then it becomes very difficult to know whether you in fact generalize or not. So that makes the whole question of machinery very difficult to decide. Questions of innateness are difficult to decide for two reasons. The success of AI, that kind of presents a big challenge. The other reason is oftentimes when you point out that there are universals across languages, and this is one of the main arguments, or an important argument for innateness, is to argue that, hey, we look at language after language and they all show a certain property. So in my work, we looked at syllable structure and the fact that languages prefer structures such as blog to structures such as lbog, L-B-O-G. That seems very clear. But the thing about this, as well as many other preferences, is that there is a correlation between what languages like to do and what the functional pressures of our body dictate. So if I ask my undergraduates why blog, then everybody tells me, what to say. And the intuitive theory behind it is that it's those functional pressures, meaning how easy it is for you to say, it's the constraints on you, articulatory system and an audition, that they are driving the force. And in every area of language universal, in many areas of linguistic universals, you find such correspondences between what languages like to do and some functional explanation. Phonology is probably the area where you see those things most clearly, but nowadays people are exploring those ideas elsewhere as well. And the problem is that when people find those correlations, they assume causation, meaning if you find any functional explanation of what's going on, people kind of jump to the conclusion that it's this functional cause or functional factor that is causing the structure that you see. So in this specific case, so why do you prefer blog? Because it's easy to say, or because it's easy to hear. That's what my undergraduates think. And so do professional scientists. And to me, it's not a done deal. to me, this is an empirical question that you need to go and explore, as indeed we have, and there are ways to do so. So the fact that you find correlation in principle is ambiguous between two explanations. One is it's not language, it's not UG, it's the functional system, the sensory and motor systems that are driving the cart here. That's what makes language the way it is. But the alternative possibility is, well, maybe it is abstract linguistic principles that are doing the driving, except for those principles are not entirely crazy, they're not entirely arbitrary, rather they have evolved so that they optimize those sensory and motor pressures, which I don't think is super surprising. So that predicts that, yes, you will find some correlation between, putative UG and those sensory motor pressures, but what's pushing the cart, so to speak, is UG rather than sensory motor system. And merely showing a correlation doesn't adjudicate between these possibilities. So in my work, we took it very seriously. So for example, to figure out whether it's blog that's doing it, whether the preference for blog is coming from, it's easier for you to say. Then in collaboration with my colleague Alvaro Pasqualeone, who is a neuroscientist who does transcranial magnetic stimulation, what we did is zap the motor system that controls the articulators, the lips specifically, and looked at what this is doing to your linguistic preferences. And conversely, what happens when you zap Broca's area? And what we found is a dissociation between them. So the point is, these are questions that you need to explore. You may or may not like the evidence that we produced. I think they're clear, but my point is not to defend the solution, but rather to defend the method. I am very concerned about the attempt to jump from correlations to causation. I think this needs to be sorted out. And I think it's this disagreement that is behind a lot of the ambiguity that we're having in the field right now.
Yeah, Professor, I did in fact read a blog post written on your work from your lab by Northeastern University. And so correct me if I'm wrong, in like a very elementary level, if I could put it this way, is it that you're at the moment claiming that it's as if these like UG or these abstract principles, they aren't, first of all, they aren't arbitrary and random, but they've kind of evolved to suit our existence as Homo sapiens, the same way, let's say, a physical limb or something has evolved.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the working hypothesis.
I see. Yeah.
But again, I think for me, it's more important to tell people that just showing a correlation isn't necessarily proof. It's not a smoking gun of causation. It's more important for me to emphasize this methodological claim than to push my own interpretation of the data. So I think that there is probably a lot that need to be done, many more controls, and to completely look at this question. And we have contributed some, but by no means I would argue that we completely resolve the issue. What really bothers me is that the attempt to view the correlation and to jump to the conclusion that, oh, we know what's going on. I think that's really unfortunate.
I see. Yes. So as any honorable scientist would say, we need more empiricism, more testing, more experimentation.
Yes.
Love it. In fact, Professor, maybe this kind of opens the way for us to jump into a question that I've been fascinated by pretty much all my life and kind of obsessed with. I'm so glad you mentioned this in your book. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump back to your book at once here. And this is this question on abstract knowledge and embodied cognition. And I love,
very much related. Yes.
And I love the part in your book. So if you don't mind me just reading out a small excerpt, in page 138, you state in chapter 9 that abstraction and embodiment are not mutually exclusive. Cognition could well encompass multiple distinct mechanisms that run according to different computational principles. The conclusion that one mechanism exists does not automatically preclude the other. And again, as I said, I loved what you wrote on this. So this also seems like one of those ongoing quote unquote wars in the world of cognitive psychology. Yeah, if you don't mind, please kind of elucidating and educating us on why you believe that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. They're not at conflict with each other, between abstract knowledge and embodied cognition, and kind of what's your current working thesis on these two ideas?
So I think why they don't have to be mutually exclusive is pretty simple logically. I mean, you can have two. So maybe we should start by talking about should we clarify what they each mean?
Yes, please. That would be great. Yes.
Yeah. So the notion, so the so-called classical view of cognition, which more precisely is known as the computational theory of mind, assumed that what's doing the causal work in cognition is algebraic representations that are structured. So there are symbols, and the symbols have form and structure of these symbols that drive mental computations. So for example, if you know that I have a big ball, you know that I have a ball. And that's a property of human cognition. Every time I say I have a big ball, it implies that I have a ball. The goal of cognitive science in this view was to explain what is it about the structure of what is it about the structure of my representation that not only enables that, but in fact require that each time you think about a big ball, you imply a ball. And they said, well, you have these complex symbols. Every time you represent the big ball, it's not like a whole complex, it's not an analyzed item for big ball, but rather it has components, formal components that correspond to the semantic components. So there's going to be a representation of your brain that for the ball and for the big, and therefore if you have big ball, it literally implies ball as well, because the interpretation of the complex symbol depends on its part. So that's kind of the computational theory of mind. It's view of language basically as literally a mechanical system that works on those symbols. And since the symbols have structure, formal structure, and they have certain meaning, it follows that if you know the A component of A and B, you must know if you know A, B, you must know A, for instance. So all this has to do with the structure for having these abstract symbols and mental representations. Now, embodied cognition rejects this for the most part. So why is it that your encoding of concept is not based on these algebraic discrete symbols with this combinatorial structure, but rather by the all my experiences with events in the world? So why is it that this battle is blue? What is my concept of a battle? Well, I don't have any abstract symbol in my brain. It's how this battle feels. It's how cold it is, and how shiny it is, and how round it is in my hand. And if I didn't have a hand, I would not have the same concept of the battle, because my physical interaction with the battle forms part of what I understand as a battle. So this is the notion of embodied cognition. It's really embodiment. It's the interaction of my body below my brain with the world that dictates my understanding of it. In principle, you could have both, right? You can have a rich sense of sensory motor interactions and symbolic machinery, and you can encode the world in both ways. But many proponents of embodied cognition take the strong position that not only you have it, but you only have it. So you don't need, all this business of structured representations, the computational theory of mind, is completely baloney. You don't need it. You can explain everything in terms of these sensory motor interactions. And when stated in this way, I think this is an empirical claim that, again, you can test. So as we said before, if your understanding of phonology was entirely dependent on the motor system, then breaking the motor system, disrupting it, say by TMS, ought to have disrupted your understanding of language. And it doesn't look like it's the case. Certainly it doesn't completely eliminate your understanding of phonology, which is an area that should be very strongly dependent on the motor system. So I'm not arguing against the motor theory. And in fact, there are certainly other aspects, low-level aspects of speech perception, such as how do you tell ba from pa, where there's very strong evidence that you rely on embodiment. So I think I jumped to this notion of motor simulation. Part of what this embodied cognition theory is saying is that not only what you know consists of these sensory and motor interactions, but in order for you to conceive of a notion, you need to simulate what it would be for you to act on this in a particular way. So for me to think a battle, I need to simulate what it would be for me, for my hand to grab the battle and how it would feel and so forth. This is an empirical claim, so you can see whether, so as I started saying, at the low levels of cognition, there is evidence that indeed such simulations take place. So what we have found, and many other people have found, is that when you hear the sound ba, you enact the lip motor area of the brain that controls the lips, and therefore if you're going to disrupt it, you're going to selectively impair your ability to perceive the sound ba, and not the sound ta, which involves the tongue. So evidence like that suggests that yes, there is embodiment and there is motor simulation, just as this view predicts. So the view is not incorrect categorically. What seems to me incorrect is the strong claim that this is sufficient to get language off the ground at all levels.
And then how do you propose then that both of these can kind of, let's say, you said yes, logically they could coexist, but what would be an example when you say that embodied cognition on its own can't explain how language is formed?
So the example that I gave you came from this case of syllable structure. So we asked, why do you prefer blog to ulbog across languages, which does seem to be the case. Yeah. In fact, it's not just these two structures. There is a whole hierarchy there that certain syllables are better than others, and those are better than others, and so forth. So it's a complex hierarchy there. And the question is it that because the good guys are easy to say and the bad guys are hard to say? And embodied cognition predicts that should matter even if the task at hand is just to listen. So even if all I'm asking you is listen to blah, tell me if it has one syllable or two, you're not supposed to say anything. And yet, according to embodied cognition, for you to just hear it, you need to simulate what it would be for you to say it. So if this thing is presumably easy to say, you should be accurate. If it's hard to say, you should be less accurate. But critically, this ability to say, to literally control the motor program of, in this case, your lips, is going to be play a causal role in your ability to perceive it, such that if you can't do that, if you can't move your lips, you should not be able to perceive it properly, to hear it properly. So perceiving depends on acting. Perceiving perception and action are intimately linked together. And that predicts that if we would not enable you, or if we disable the motor system, then perception of language structure ought to be impaired. So if language structure is all about this simulation and how easy it is to compute, then if there's no simulation, you shouldn't care about language structure. You should show no evidence that you are sensitive to that. And that's not at all what we found.
I see, and that's where you would say, okay, there's some kind of let's call it UG or like an abstract knowledge that does still allow us to
Yeah.
engage language.
So abstraction and UG are not synonyms. From this, all you can conclude is whatever you know is not just the result of motor simulation. Whether or not it's universal is a separate question that we have explored elsewhere.
Yeah.
But it tells you something about the role of abstraction, which is further strengthened by the fact that in the second paper in this series that I think came last fall, if I remember, what we did is simultaneously in the same participants looked at both how they respond to, how they identify simple sounds like ba versus pa, so very low level properties, versus how they look at syllable structure. And what we found is, yes, the lip motor area, this motor simulation business, certainly plays a role in low level perception, just everybody else thought. It's specifically in the syllable hierarchy that we didn't find, in language structure, namely, that we didn't find a role. So that's this selectivity really suggests to whereas Broca's area did play a role. Yeah. So this double dissociation, as it's called technically, suggests to us that you might need both.
Excellent. Yeah, you truly are a bona fide scientist, Professor, because I tried to jump across and kind of conclude that your experiment on embodied cognition probably means we need abstract knowledge too, but then you claim that no, what that really says is that it falsifies the theory that all we need is embodied cognition. So I'm glad you clarified that.
So just to clarify again, what the experiments show is that you need abstraction. They don't necessarily show you need innateness.
I see. Understood. Yeah. Okay. So again, I'm going to jump back to like a vague, more of like a naive question. Clearly, you probably can see that I'm still a neophyte. I'm still getting my hang around this field. But
great questions so far.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. But I guess this is, I don't even know whether this is an unfair question to ask, because this is pretty much a question we've been trying to answer since time immemorial, really. What is unique about human language?
We don't know for sure.
Yeah.
It's, again, like everything else, it's an empirical question, but we have some clues. So I think we need to distinguish between two questions. Is there a definition to the notion of natural language? So is natural language a kind, in the sense that there is something that defines all languages? So English and French and Swahili and Mandarin, is there something that's common to all of them? And the second is it unique to them? So is it only defining these languages and not other systems, right? So that there are different questions at hand. You can look for those characteristics at two levels. One is to ask, are there some, as the linguist Charles Hockett said, are there some design principles that are shared across all languages? And you can then look at more intricate aspects of language structure, and that's really what universal grammar is asking. This is really a question of, is there something that defines human languages as such, because they're all molded by the same cookie cutter, so to speak, by the same by universal grammar. We talked about universal grammar, and I see some evidence for the possibility that maybe it plays a role, although, as we had discussed, this is only open to discussion and debate in the field. With respect to design properties, so the linguist Hockett came with all these design principles of language, and the fact that all languages have meaning, and they talk about things that are not here and now and so forth. But many of those things are also shared with other systems of non-human animals, for instance. There is one component, though, that seems to be one design principle that seems to be unique to language, and that is this notion that is called duality of patterning. And that is, so it's kind of the double helix of language, so to speak, in the sense that language has patterns. So the whole point about language is that it's not just, you don't just memorize and analyze wholes, but rather there are patterns with structure. But those patterns exist in two levels. The one level that everybody is aware of is syntax. So if I say the dog, dogs bite men or men bite dogs, it gets you completely different meaning, which means that in this case, the syntactic organization matters, and if you change it, you change meaning. So that is this area in which you take, to simplify, you take words which have meaning, and how you order them, how you pattern them makes a difference. This is one level. But there is a second level, which is every such word is not an atom, but rather it's a molecule that is further constructed from meaningless elements. So if I say dog, you get the ga, one combination of those sounds, you get one meaning. If I say ga, da, you get a different, completely different meaning, right? Yeah. So the ordering, there is pattern. That's the fact that when you change the ordering, you change the significance of the sequence, means that the patterning matters, but this is not a pattern of meaningful units, but rather of meaningless units. In spoken language, languages, those elements are sounds, are phonemes, but you can also have other types of meaningless elements in sign languages. So there are head movements, hand shapes, and so forth, but they too are meaningless elements. So it turns out that every human language has this trick. Every human language has these two levels of patterning, and I'm not aware of any exception to this rule. We are not aware of any system of animal communication that has this trick. So animals can communicate in very complex ways. They even have rules. So animal communication is great, but the design is different to ours. It's not a value statement of which one is better and which one is worse. It's different. We have this double layer of patterning, and we are yet to find an animal that has that. So I think that suggests something that's unique to human
language.
But again, the field is very much divided as to whether there is anything beyond that in fact defines language, that is unique to language, and whether it's specific to language, and this debate is ongoing.
Yeah, and of course, I'm assuming this opens up many other avenues, such as if you want to create an agent, let's say an AI agent that engages in language the way humans do, we need to understand first of all what our design principles are to even build something.
Well, this is where we get to the Skinner-Chomsky debate, right? Because the current AI view takes the view of let this all emerge. If you feed it enough data and you have a very good learning algorithm, the system will figure it out. And we don't know what is it that it figures out.
Black box kind of, yeah.
Something it figures out. And this is really open to a big debate right now.
Certainly, yeah. In fact, I heard Chomsky, which is unbelievable. He's in his, I think, late 90s, and he's still doing interviews and podcasts. Yeah. Truly, he was saying that with LLMs, that yes, they are marvelous engineering tools, but he disagrees with the kind of the notion that, as you said, if you just keep feeding it more data in like a black box kind of way, eventually we'll have some sort of AI, let's say, an AI agent that engages the language the way we do.
I think his concern is, what does it really tell you? So it's a piece of engineering, but what kind of explanation does it give you about what is the cause of every child speaking a language? So obviously children are not exposed to this massive data. So what it's giving you is kind of, it's mimicking the ability of a child to form sentences, but it's not clear that it's doing it in any way that is remotely similar to what the child is doing, and in so doing, this does not provide an explanation of how human language actually works. So I agree with this concern. So again, this is getting to this notion of, to what extent do we need to worry about what human beings bring with them to the learning acquisition task as organisms? So to what extent do you need to look at the organism as opposed to assuming it's all out there in the data? So the AI answer is, it's mostly out there. We need to just find a good way to milk it. And Chomsky's approach was to start from the inside, and it remains a huge debate to be determined.
Yes, certainly, and sometimes even a contentious one. So the other bit is, and what I love about the book is, this is also in a way sort of like a book on like social psychology, because it's a lot on what lay people believe. And in fact, being a layperson myself, I kind of had this belief too for the longest time, which is I always equated what we call human language to reading. And in the blind storyteller, you state in page 203, if you don't mind me reading it, you say, many people think of reading as a process of visual pattern recognition. For example, being able to consistently register the contrast between symmetrical letters such as D and B. If that is the case, then it stands to reason that when reading goes awry, the culprit is a visual deficit. But in reality, visual patterns are just a means to an end, which is language. Reading is a technology that gets you there. So, Professor, if you could delineate what the difference between reading and language is, that would be great, please.
So there are two things we need to explain. What is reading and how it differs from language?
Yes.
So the true theory, what is the true science about? And the second is what people think how this all works. So
yes,
there is
that's
the
a better way of putting
scientific theory, and there's the intuitive theory, which happens to be in disagreement, and that's where we mess things up. So, so there is a sense in which reading is very different from language. I often start my psychology of language classes by working really hard to disabuse people of the notion that language and reading are the same thing. They aren't. Language is natural. You take every child, they will develop language. If you don't expose them to language, they will grow one naturally, even if they're not exposed to a language. They do it naturally. They don't need language lessons. Reading is not like that. So most children, if you don't teach them how to read explicitly, they will never read. There are tons of societies that are doing just well without reading and writing. Not so for language. So language is universal to all human societies. Reading is not. So they're divorced in this sense, for sure. Nonetheless, there is this interesting property of human brains that the neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene has pointed out, which is when human brains come to invent a new system, they don't invent it completely anew, but rather what they do is recycle existing systems that are innate and kind of repurpose them for the new, for this new purpose. And the link between reading and language exactly follows those lines. So when you look at how reading systems are designed, they could have been completely divorced from language. They could have been completely arbitrary, but that's not the case, because the letters that we use for a system like alphabetic system like English correspond to linguistic sounds for the most part. Even in writing systems as in Mandarin, it's true that there are visual origins of the symbols that they also have semantic component, but eventually what they stand up for is also phonological sounds. They stand for syllables. So it turns out that when people come to invent language, they kind of design it on the principles of how language works. You can think about it in terms of human brains. When they start processing language, they start with the phonology. And then, so when you perceive speech, that the first thing that you get is the sound structure of language. And from there, you proceed to syntax and so forth. So it's like to go on the linguistic highway, so to speak, in the brain, you need to start by having some phonological code. So if you're trying to hijack the same highway to create reading, you better start by encoding phonology as well. And that's how it explains the correspondence between how reading works and how language works. Reading as a system is taking the language or hijacking a component of the language system and repurposing it to for a new technology.
Mm.
And that is why all reading systems that we know of encode some phonological units at some level. It doesn't necessarily need to be at the level of phonemes. It could be syllables, but there is also some phonological component. There is a ton of research that shows that when you and I read, well, I'm not a native speaker, but when I read in my language and you read in your language, even though we read silently, we will automatically extract all this phonological component as integral part of the reading process. So you think about reading as a visual affair. It's something that happens only in your eyes. Of course, it begins with the eyes, but it looks like it invariably goes through the phonological system at some point, or else reading does not work as it should. So you must get some aspects of the phonology of what you read. How do we know that? Because if you get two words that have the same phonology, such as rose, the flower, and rows as in two rows of chairs, people confuse them all the time. Even if you have R-O-Z-E, which is not a word, people will also confuse them. And using the proper experiments, you can show that it's really the phonology that confuses them, which shows that people have consulted this information, or else they would not have been confused. So the point about showing how we stumble is to show how reading actually works, and the fact that the way it actually works is using phonology. It's using this part of language. So that's the real theory of reading. And we also know that when, that the ability to perceive sounds so it's not just phonology, but also speech. When the ability to perceive speech sounds is impaired, this is a characteristic of dyslexia. So people with dyslexia have problem with perceiving speech sounds. Now, that's not what lay people think. So if you ask a lay person, Johnny can't read, he's a 6-year-old and he can't read, what do you think is wrong with him? And invariably people tell you there is something that's wrong with their eyes. And if they think that there is something that's wrong with Billy because of Jimmy, whatever he is, that if the problem is congenital, which we know that's the case in dyslexia, that it is a congenital disorder, people invariably think the problem can only be in the eyes. It can't be this abstract phonological thing. This arises from this intuition that people hold, that we hold innately. So if you know that the problem is congenital, that he was born with that, then it must be somewhere in their body. But people don't think just genes. They think like in the eyes, in the ears. It can't be something that is abstract. That doesn't make sense, that the ability to, so what dyslexia really is about is in part the mechanism that allow you to map letters to sound, and which is an abstract kind of cognitive mechanism. And people have trouble recognizing that something like that could possibly be involved or impaired innately. So this is unfortunate because it's first because people misunderstand what dyslexia is all about, and that's a problem, because if you think that, if you have a child and you think that the only signal of dyslexia is switching letters, then you will fail to identify and help these children early as you need to. But indirectly, it also tells you something about how we think about what is innate and what is innateness, and explain some of the other biases that I've shown in this book that show how our misconception about what is innate lead us to this crazy conclusion that what we know cannot possibly have an innate basis.
Yep, and of course, this probably leads us to your twin principles, the twin principles of essentialism and dualism. Now, I know you've spoken about this, Professor, in many podcasts, but I still want to ask because it's a fascinating idea. Well, to put it simply, sorry, you claim that our blindness to human nature is rooted in human nature itself. Sorry, I got a bit of a cough. So, firstly, I'm wondering, could you kind of, flesh out what that statement means by the fact that our blindness to human nature is sort of innate to it's sort of a part of being human itself, and then maybe from there develop the ideas of essentialism and dualism.
Sure. So maybe let's start with the background. So the first thing to show is that people are blind to human nature. It is a thing which people may not necessarily accept, because so many people assume that when a child is born, that newborns know nothing about the world, that they have no abstract concepts whatsoever, that there's no possibility that they would know, for example, what is an object, or that they will have a notion of number, or they will have even a rudimentary notion of good versus bad in very basic form. And we know because we asked these questions. And it turns out that it's not the case that people simply think that nothing is innate. So if you ask them, well, do newborns prefer happy faces to angry faces? They'll tell you, sure, yeah, of course they do. And that's actually wrong, they don't. So when the experiments have been done, there's no preferences for the happy face. But when you ask them, well, will a newborn infant understand that 3 sounds and 3 lights share something in common, distinct from, say, 3 and 9, 3 sounds and 3 and 9 lights? And they'll look at you like, what? And even though when you can explain how this can be done, so these experiments have been done in fact, and you can give people the exact description of how the experiment was done and ask them to make a prediction. So this is how we can study that, and here is how the experiment was designed. Now tell us what will the infants do if they appreciate this fact, and they'll tell you there's no way that they will do so. And that is wrong, because the experiments have been done, and newborn infants can appreciate abstract number in the sense, as well as they have a concept of object and so forth. So there is a problem here, right? Because science tells us that there is stuff that infants know, and there are good reasons to think that this knowledge is innate. Because it's very difficult to explain how this can be learned from the experience that's available to the infant in utero. And second, because you see it in other animals. So in many of these experiments, there are parallel demonstrations in human and non-human animals, say in chicks, and you find similar things. And this evolutionary continuity gives you further room to believe that this knowledge can be innate. And yet we don't accept it, right? So when you ask lay people, they cannot conceive of the possibility that knowledge can be innate. They even kind of look at you like this is really, the very proposition seems to me to them as an oxymoron. So the question is why that's the case, where this bias to innate knowledge comes from. Now, there can be many reasons. There doesn't need to be a single answer. So, but And there have been other proposals in the literature, such as perhaps you have a lot of experience with learning, but yet, you can learn also motor actions. You can learn how to swim. So why is it knowledge specifically that you have trouble with? Maybe it is you're worried about the social implications, right? So if we're innately the way we are, then if maybe we're different, and that's a concern. What it fails to explain is why is it knowledge specifically that gets us exercise, right? If we're worried that about social discrimination, why does the notion of object is a problem? I mean, very hard to see what social relevance it has. So here's my proposal. The proposal is that this bias arises from two intuitive principles, and that are based on innate principles. So whether or not these two guys that I'll explain are in fact innate or not is less clear, but the roots certainly are. So let me explain what I'm talking about. So there's one in each of the two kind of partners in crime, and one is called intuitive essentialism and the other is called intuitive dualism. And there's lots of literature that shows that each of them matters as we think. Intuitive essentialism governs how we think about what's innate. So when children think about what makes an animal look the way it does, why does it have a tail, why does it have this color, they're telling you there is something inside the animal that makes it what it is, inside its body. So that the notion is that there is this essence that doesn't change, that lives in your inside, and it's in the body. Okay. The problem is that people also think about knowledge that as if it's not in the body. People think about the knowledge as it's something that's in the mind, as if the mind is ethereal and distinct from the body. So there are intuitive dualists. This is completely under the hood. It's not something it's not a doctrine. They're not philosophers, but even if you ask children, beautiful work by Jesse Bering, by other people who show that children think about the mind as ethereal, distinct from the body. And knowledge lives in the mind, not in the body. Here's the problem, right? If you think about knowledge, such as your understanding of number, as it's not in the body, and if you think that everything that's innate must be in the body, it follows that knowledge cannot be innate because it's in the wrong place, right? Here is the body, here is the mind, there is my knowledge, there is what's innate, and that's in the wrong place. It can't be innate. And this is how the bias, we think, arises. So what I've told you so far is how our troubles with innateness arise from these intuitive principles. But then where do these principles come from, right? Hard to tell. Essentialism, in both cases, those are principles that are observed across cultures, even when what children, for example, believe is different from what the adults. So the anthropologist Rita Astuti has done really beautiful work that shows that children in Madagascar, in a small community there, the adults talk about, why is that a person has something wrong with their leg? Well, their mother talked ill of some person and they cursed her, and that's how, that's affected. So this is a very Lamarckian view of well, not evolution, but basically you bodily traits are acquired through social transmission. So when you do the same experiments with children in this place, they do show evidence that they understand essence. So they think that if you have two animals and one is the biological offspring of the other, what's true of the father will be true of the son rather than of an adoptive, and it won't get what it gets its biology from the biological parent, not from an adopting parent. So that suggests to us, so essentialism is not something that's innate in the sense that you see it in very young infants, although it has some roots very early on. But it seems to do something that we just develop naturally for whatever reason. You see the same with dualism. It's extremely prevalent across cultures, belief in afterlife and the supernatural, and of course religion, and all this stuff. You find it very, very broadly across cultures, even in cultures that do not tend to speak about those things openly. Why that's the case was never clear. Paul Bloom has long suggested, the psychologist Paul Bloom has suggested that maybe intuitive dualism arises from core knowledge. So what is core knowledge? Core knowledge are those innate systems that infants are born with. And two of those systems are critical here. And one system guides how we think about people, and another guides how we think about objects. And these two systems are in contrast with each other. And because of this contrast, that's what leads to dualism. So the idea is that, so basically, the way it works is you think about objects behave, what makes objects don't move on their own. They can only move if there is a physical contact between objects. People can move on their own because of what they think, because of what's in their mind. And there's obviously a tension between these two ideas. And recognizing this tension, a child might decide that the mind, what makes a person behave, is not embodied. It's not part of the body because it doesn't obey the laws of physics that other objects do. And that's how you become a dualist. In recent work in my lab, we tested this theory. And what we found is that the logic was very simple. We reasoned that if dualism really has its root in these core knowledge systems that are innate, then if you find a group of individuals in which one of the system is impaired, then that should have downstream effects on their dualism and furthermore on their ability to accept innateness. And that's exactly what we found. So in one study, we looked at people with autism who are famously ones that have difficulties reasoning about the minds of others. So the people system is weaker. And indeed, we found that they are kind of released from the curse, so to speak. So they are less dualist than neurotypicals, as you would predict. And they also are less biased against innateness, also, as you would predict. In another study, we looked at males versus females. So males also tend to be lower on the people system than females. And we found the same. They too were less cursed by dualism and less also cursed by this rejection of innate knowledge. So that suggests to us that dualism itself, so now I'm talking just about dualism, may not be specifically innate. There may not be any selective advantage of you being a dualist directly, but maybe the roots of dualism, the constellation of our core systems is such that they lead you towards dualism, and that's how all this series of unfortunate events arises.
Certainly. Professor, I don't know if you've written about this or worked on this in some other areas, but would you say, again, a bit of a speculative question, that there are certain evolutionary advantages to having these twin principles of being essentialists and dualists? As in, I don't want to just say that they're arbitrarily kind of in our nature, so to speak, but rather, do you think there are any, again, as I said, there's a reason, evolutionary speaking, that we do have this kind of co-knowledge?
So the core knowledge has advantages for sure. So there is definitely core knowledge to understanding what an object is. You want a chick to go after its mother, not after, you want to recognize it as an entity, her body as an entity, and having understanding of the minds of others is definitely advantage. So you don't need to assume that dualism has an advantage. It's enough to assume that its engines, the two engines that make you a dualist, are innate. You don't need to assume that dualism is innate.
Okay.
You get it for free, so to speak. In recent work, I'm actually exploring the possibility that dualism might do some good, but until I know about it, I don't want to talk about it. So talk to me in a year or so, and I'll let you know.
Fantastic. And I would love to. I would love to follow up on that. And on the note again of dualism and essentialism, one of my favorite chapters from the book, which is your chapter on neuroscience. What is our irrational love affair with neuroscience? And I think it is in chapter 11 where you say insane about the brain. And interestingly, just a bit of a funny anecdote in the podcasting world. Currently, the most listened to podcast is in fact a podcast by a neuroscientist. So Andrew Huberman. So it's people, you are absolutely right that people have this, as you said, irrational love affair with neuroscience. So yeah, from this lens of essentialism and dualism, can you kind of explain as to why lay people are insane about the brain?
Yeah, so I think one clue comes from the fact that I don't think that people care so much about the details, about how the brain does it specifically, as much as the fact that it does it. So I think what kind of every time people are kind of marveling at is the fact that the life of the mind has a basis in the brain, which should have been obvious, right? What else do you expect, right? Science tells us that thinking is a physical affair that affects physical processes in the brain. So of course then of course thinking is going to show up in the brain. So what the technical literature in neuroscience is to show exactly what happens and how the brain gives us to thinking, which for the most part we don't understand. So we don't understand, say, anything about the computational theory of, or for the most we understand very little about the computational theory of mind and how it's actually implemented in the brain. But for people, that's not what they care about. So when they hear this, it's really like, oh, it's actually in the brain. That's the news for them, which is very strange indeed. If you're a dualist, then that would be big news for you, because that in fact, if you're a dualist, you have troubles understanding how is it that the mind can actually affect behavior. So if you think about, I want this battle, and this wish that your people theory tells you it's in your mind, causes my very material hand to grab the battle. And how is it possible? How can mind command matter? This is something that was a problem for Descartes, and we did Descartes, and we did some research that suggests that it's even a problem for lay people. When lay people think about such interactions, they have kind of a dissonance, is this notion that the mind can command the body when you look at that carefully. And neuroscience solves this problem because it's telling you, listen, it's not the mind that's doing the lifting, it's the brain that commands the hand. So body interacts with body, and basically the problem is solved. Furthermore, if you're an essentialist and you believe that what's innate is in the body, and now you see it's the body that's the cause of my behavior, and then you're beginning to think, well, maybe this is something that's kind of telling us something that's very deep in me. It's something about my essence. It's something that I'm born with. So if I have depression and you detect it in my brain, so all of a sudden, oh, there must be something that runs in the family, and you better not marry this person, and you would discriminate against them. And it's all baloney, because the fact that something manifests in the brain tells you nothing about whether it's innate or not. And yet what we have found is that when you give people this information, they jump to the horrible conclusion that this trait, depression, for instance, is more likely to be innate, and they show more stigma. So that's a very serious problem. So dualism makes you super curious about the brain because it solves the mind-body dissonance. If you're essentialist, you look at the brain as providing further evidence about what's innate, and therefore speaking up to your deep essence, what makes you who you are, and both of them are based on misconceptions.
Yeah, interestingly, I read a funny, rather funny essay. Even Descartes was trying to, he was wrestling with this problem, and then he theorized that in our brain we have this thing called the pineal gland or something, and that's what gives our abstract mind to manifest in the material world. And so not only a great philosopher like Descartes, but as you said, even lay people struggle with this question. I'm a bit cognizant of the time, Professor, but a quick tangential question, in fact. It's on the idea of emotions. And in one part of the book, you say that this idea that innate computational mechanisms are alchemy. And I believe, in fact, let me just read out the excerpt if that's okay. On page 168, you say that it is bad enough to assert that emotions are computations. Claiming that these computations are innate goes way too far. But this is precisely what evolutionary psychology asserts, and in doing so, it challenges our core beliefs to the max. Not only does it claim that emotions are computations rather than bodily states, it further suggests that the mechanisms that affect this reckoning are innately specialized, that there is one innate program for shame, another innate program for maternal love, and so on. So I guess my question would be, what is the layperson's understanding of emotions? And then would be, what does, at the moment, the current science tells us, or the truth, let's say?
So lay people consider emotions very important for who they are. They think of them as part of their essence. But of course, they think that anything that's innate must be in the body. So when we ask them, to predict whether certain emotions are innate, what we found is that people think that emotions that they consider to be embodied, that you can see them in the face, so they think they manifest in your stomach and so forth, those are the emotions that are more likely to be innate. And you can find, that's exactly what, of course, essentialism predicts, and you can further show this causal link such that if you give people information that a certain emotion is in the body, so if you tell them you made a brain scan and you can detect it in the body, they jump to the conclusion that this emotion is innate. So people think that, again, link innateness to being in the body. And as we said, people don't think that thinking generally, what you know, cannot possibly be innate. So because of this, you think about emotions as bodily states rather than as cognitions, as way of thinking. It's interesting, though, that it's interesting when you look at the history of the field and you see how these debates are running, that there's the question of whether emotions are innate is very, very controversial. And most of this literature about whether emotions are innate really looks at the question of whether emotions show up mostly in the face, also in the voice, but mostly in the face. And then there is a huge debate between those that say that universally facial emotions, that facial emotions are universal, and those that are not. And I'm just sitting, I mean, that's not my field. I'm reading this and I see that the results are very mixed, and there's evidence to support both sides. But you wonder why people are asking this question in the first place. So why assume that emotions are just facial expressions to start with? From a methodological perspective, I could understand why people started looking at that this way, because, that's an easy way to look at, people in small scale societies and to look at their emotional understanding, but there's no reason to assume that it must be this way. There's no, in fact, there might be an evolutionary advantage for not revealing your emotional expressions and to be, to being a poker player. So notion that if it's innate, it must show in the face seems like why make these assumptions in the first place? I don't know, there might be, as I pointed out, why scientists think the way they do. It's hard to tell. But one wonders whether this resistance that there is to this notion that emotions are computations might come from the same empiricist bias. And that's exactly what evolutionary psychologists claim, right? So if, there's research that asks what is the basis of shame? And the answer is, it's not necessarily that it's a certain facial expression, but rather it's a computation that is designed to protect you from social devaluation. So the idea is that you want to keep your good standing in society, and if there is a danger of it being devaluated because somebody observed you doing something awful, that will cost you. You don't want that to happen, and shame protects you from this. It's kind of an internal signal to attend to this problem. That makes predictions about what circumstances should elicit shame. And when evolutionary scientists have looked at this question, they found support for this idea across cultures. So, for example, if something awful happens to you, if you do something shameful, if other people watch it, then you predict the shame response to be more serious, and which is exactly what this theory predicts. So in the segment you've read, I tried to answer the question of why people do not think typically about emotions in this way. And the answer is that such computations do not intuitively seem like they could possibly be innate, because people don't think that knowledge can be innate. So that can explain the resistance to this notion.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, Professor, since we've only got a few more minutes left, I would love to get to the more of the speculative questions. I don't want to miss out on that. And I was glad to hear that you said before we started recording that you, in fact, are in the process of publishing a paper on Qualia, or the question of consciousness.
It's published.
Oh, it's already published. Excellent. So it's and it pertains to dualism and essentialism too, right? The work you've currently been doing.
Yes, in fact, to both of them. Yes.
Excellent. Yeah. So yeah, just in general, what are your sort of intimations on the idea of Qualia? And then a bit more specifically, how does cognition differ from what philosophers call Qualia, or in fact, does it differ at all?
I'm not in a position really to answer this question. People have a sense of their conscious experiences, and they have some intuitions about what they are. And in the research and I think the big debate in the field is how what is consciousness, and what is its place in reality, in ontology. And the work of the brilliant philosopher David Chalmers has long argued that consciousness is distinct from the body. So, for example, you can think about other creatures that will have your body, but will not have the same conscious experiences as you have. And that, to him, I'm not doing justice to his argument, but basically what the conclusion that he arrives at is the notion that consciousness is not a physical properties, it is distinct from the physical. And this is not because you think about it this way, it is this way for him. So he believes that this reflects how things are ontologically, that in reality, consciousness is distinct from the physical. But of course, we just spent like an hour and a half talking about how we are intuitive dualists. So one wonders, is that really because consciousness is distinct from the body, or because it only seems distinct to the body in our human eyes? And in many, Chalmers gives several examples in which those things go together, and it's really difficult to tell which one is going on. But in one of these examples, which indeed concerns qualia, the conscious experiences of, say, seeing a red rose, these properties dissociate in a way that one can, I don't know if we have time now to go into all the predictions, but basically, this is a case where if you take dualism and essentialism together, it will make you predict that people should think about what it takes for you. So what happens when you see a rose for the first time? If it really alters you in a significant way, then it must be something that pertains to your essence. And where is your essence? It's in your body. So that would predict that the properties, that the conscious experiences that are possibly transformative, the ones that are really important to you, are bound to be those experiences that you can link to the body, or else they can't pertain to your essence. They can't be transformative. As I read the Chalmers view, for him, consciousness is distinct from the body. So all experiences should be separate from the body, and it should not depend on how significant that is your experience, should not depend on how embodied it is, because it's not an embodied affair. But that's not what we found. What we found was that when people are given those vignettes and asked to make predictions about that, what they believe is that if you're going to gain a significant experience, you're seeing a rose so one of these famous examples, Mary in the black and white room, Mary sees a rose for the first time, and we're asking people, well, is it significant for her? And they say, sure it is. And if you're going to run a brain scan, is it going to show up in the brain? And they tell you, yes. And which means they think about this conscious experience as part of the physical world. Yeah. And in fact, you can make various twists on that, and the bottom line is, as you gain a conscious experience, if you compare an experience in which she just sees the rose and she is not conscious of it, and one in which she sees it and it is conscious, what's the difference? Well, being conscious is more significant. It's also more likely to manifest in the body.
I see. So,
and the more likely it is to manifest in the body, the more physical you see it, the stronger is the experience, which is not what you would expect, right? If the original explanation, Chalmers' explanation of the black and white, Mary in the black and white room, is the conscious experience is distinct from the body, and somehow you're privy to this fact, or else why we care about your intuitions about this case in the first place. So consciousness is different from the body, and you're privy to that. And yes, people have intuitions about that, but in their view, consciousness is actually an embodied experience. So, and furthermore, in other research, in another experiment of this series, we found that the more dualists they are, the stronger their intuitions about Mary. So there is very strong evidence that suggests that the source of this of what you gain in consciousness, people think about that conscious experience as something that is very physical, very much in the body. In this paper, I explain exactly how dualism and essentialism conspire to give you this intuition. So how you can be both dualist, but also essentialism can make you think about that transformative experience of being in the body. But I think it presents some challenge to this notion that, so you can explain everything that's going on in our intuition. So either you assume that the initial assumption that we can have intuitions about consciousness is false. This is one possibility. Or if you do assume that we have intuitions about consciousness, then what this suggests is at the very least, what this suggests is that the reason why we see consciousness the way we do comes from our internal biases. There is no need to assume anything about ontology here. So of course, I can't tell anything about what ontology is.
Of course.
But the psychology of that gives a very compelling story.
Yeah, but interestingly, it's only a philosopher that would kind of ontologize and try to maybe argue, like Chalmers does, that consciousness is something separate from the body.
Yeah, but it has been a very influential argument, and one that neuroscientists have been quite engaged with.
Yeah. What time? Okay, Professor, is it okay if we go about 5 minutes over time, or do you? Okay, I just want to ask you because I'm quite curious about this question, given you're a cognitive psychologist. So psychoanalysis, I've been fascinated by it for a long time, in fact, but more from a philosophical angle. And in fact, I got into it through philosophy. And the late Mary Rudy, who was working in an English department, in fact. So it certainly isn't a science, but just as a cognitive scientist, what are your intimations and views on the field of psychoanalysis?
I'm not as educated as I would want to be. There are definitely some very concrete empirical criticism of Freud that I think are very well placed about the falsifiability of his proposal and its empirical adequacy and all that. All this criticism is very well placed. But I think he was a genius. I think he gave cognitive science two of its most precious ideas. The first is the idea of the subconscious. I mean, I don't know the history of ideas sufficiently to know whether we should really credit him for that, but certainly he got it right. This is certainly the core of everything that's interesting about cognition generally and language specifically happens totally under the hood. It's not something that people capture, and he had the stature to have this insight, and I think this is very significant, and we owe him a debt of gratitude. The other debt of gratitude that I think is important, and people sometimes look at that as kind of they take it against him, and I don't, was this notion that thinking about the psyche in physicalist terms. So he had this thermodynamic notion of the psyche. And people say, oh, yeah, you always apply the latest in science to study the psyche, but it is not trivial to think about the psyche as a physical system because we are dualist. So this is the farthest from us to think that one can explain psychological processes in physical terms. But this is exactly the basis of the computational theory of mind, the notion that the reason that thinking is a mechanical process that manipulates this form of representations. And this notion that you can think about the psyche as a physical system is brilliant, not something that's available to us intuitively at all. So I think Freud had two very big ideas that, again, I leave it to somebody else to make the analysis of where these ideas came from and how they stayed with us. But for nothing else, I think that these are really one of the most important ideas that stay with us these days, and that we should be very grateful for them.
Certainly, I mean, in line with this book, you'd say that at least Freud could go against his human nature and overcome the blindness to study the psyche as a physical system. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you for that, Professor Berent. I know that these are highly speculative questions, but they always do fascinate me. Well, I'd love to ask so sorry, just one other thing. The paper that you mentioned when we were talking about qualia and consciousness, what exactly was the name of the paper?
It appeared in the journal Open Mind, and the name of the paper, I'm the author on that, and I should have known what is it called, and I forgot.
Is it okay if I email you afterwards and I can put it in the description down below for people to read?
I can tell you in a second. If I look at my references, and this one is called "The Hard Problem of Consciousness Arises from Human Psychology."
Excellent. I shall find it and put it in the description.
And it's an open access, so you can read it.
That is lovely. Yeah. So, Professor, what other projects are you working on? What other are there any books in the pipeline? I'd love to hear. Give us a bit of a teaser on what's next.
There's a project on dualism that's coming, and some of some of the obvious problems of dualism, but possibly also some of the silver lining of being a dualist and how you live a dualist life. So
yes, how to live a dualist life. It's probably going to be a self-help book by.
No.
I'm joking.
That's not the intention. But
absolutely, yeah. I'm joking, of course. But no, thank you so much. I'm grateful for your time, Professor. This means a lot to me, especially given hopefully next year I'll be doing my master's program, and then I'm certainly more excited than I could put it in words. So thank you so much.
Pleasure talking to you. Good luck on your master's.
Cheers.
I look forward to seeing what you do.